Mikomwood, a tale of less than masterful magic. Chapter 1. The Boy and the Sorcerer. Mikomwood, legendary and mysterious place of great wonder. We return once again to the majestic forests of these lands. Oh, how magical the air felt this early summer morning in the late year of the quacking duck. It was upon this fantastical morning that we find young Master Langy Gravelsworth tending to his little brother as always while his parents were away. His brother was playing outside the estate with some marble toys, while Langy merely sat on a lawn chair in the sun, being damned happy he wasn't poor. He was a short fellow, 17 years old, and had a haircut that would have even made a 90s accountant think it was dull. The Gravelsworth estate had belonged to the Gravelsworth Magswitch family for over 15 generations. Its great towers gave its owners a glimmering view over the Gravelsworth Valley in southern Mikomwood. Now little Langy did have interests. He always wanted to become a magician, for example. He had attended a school for a great deal of his life, yet never bothered to remember what the teachers tried to convince him was the truth. He knew the truth, and that was that life was good. He called over his butler, Sleeves. "Say, Sleeves," the boy began, "do we have any more cool drinks with little umbrellas sticking out of the glass?" "Yes, sir," Sleeves said in such a dull tone that you can only achieve by going to butler school for 10 years and aging another 200. "Will that be all, sir?" "I think I'll have some Hamish burgers for lunch as well," Langy replied. He had given this a lot of thought. He once said that if you can't tell with absolute certainty what you want for lunch, then you might just as well skip lunch and move right on to dinner. Naturally, it was utter mad cow shit. The saying made no sense, and he had only thought of it when he needed a viable excuse for telling his parents he was going to be late for lunch. It did not work. He still stuck with it, though, and quoted it whenever the question of lunch became the centerpiece of a deep and intellectual conversation. Which was never. It was not here, though, that our story gains its magnitude and magnificence in the obviously awe-worthy lands of Mikomwood. Nay, for upon this very day, this very morning, a mad sorcerer in the upper Grimsmurk mountains began uttering the first words of a spell that would quickly be interrupted by a dozen or so angry villagers that, after having to put up with it for many years, finally had enough of being ravaged by ghostly spirits, murdered by supernatural assassins, slaughtered by flying pigs, and skewed by pestering pikemen. All these demonic apparitions were nothing, though, compared to what the sorcerer had been cooking up for the past 3 months. His new creation would have waving feathers, spouting spots, and slivering slippers. He called it the Nerdbird Demonica. Fortunately, he never succeeded in giving existence to this creature, and the lands of Mikomwood are better off without it, for it was at this moment the doors to his castle ruin finally gave up and let the villagers in. They carried the mad sorcerer, who was screaming curses at the villagers, out of his residence and down the Grimsmurk hills to the village of Less Grimsmurk. The villagers tied the mad sorcerer to a pole in the middle of the village centre. The sorcerer, in a moment of less mad clarity, realized the situations and the events that would no doubt unfold next. There would be shouting. There would be reading of sentences. There would be a torch, and there would be fire. He was looking forward to none of these, especially the reading of the sentences. Therefore, he started formulating a spell in his head. First he thought the words, then he whispered the words, and then he shouted the words. The crowd paid no attention to him, and it dawned upon him that it had no effect. There was the shouting as the man approached the stool. He stepped up on the stool and started reading what the sorcerer could only think were sentences of some sort. He tried pulling on the ropes that strapped him to the pole. A man with a torch appeared. He started walking towards the center of the ring, and the crowd started taking several steps back. The sorcerer looked at the flame of the torch. Nervous as he was, sweat started appearing on his forehead. In a final act of desperation, he prayed. He prayed to whatever gods may be looking over Mikomwood right now, and that they would send him someone to save him from this awful situation. There happened to be a god looking over Mikomwood, a fate toying with the lives of man. At least, it liked to think of itself as such. It sent a ray of teleporting power down to the lands of Mikomwood. The target was a man that needs no introduction, a hero so magnificent his armor polishes itself knowing it is being worn by the greatest hero in Mikomwood. However, upon hitting our hero's head, the blank surface of his bald scalp deflected the ray and sent it way off course towards a much less qualified young fellow. An unlikely turn of events. Lange looked upon the crowd that had materialized before him. About a dozen bewildered eyes gazed upon him as well as those of an elderly man tied to a pole in the middle of the gathering. Lange did not understand this strange development in his life. He was not interested in this and wished nothing more than to have that Hamish burger for lunch. His thoughts were quickly interrupted, not so much by the people now whispering to each other, other than the people who were shouting loudly. A middle-aged man approached the boy. He was clearly the village elder, for that was how old people generally got in the village of Skeybar. Lange wanted no part of this, and before the man could open his mouth, Lange had shoved more golden Mikom coins into his hand than the village was worth, and walked up to the pole. He started untying the sorcerer. He did not understand why he had to do this. It was more of an instinct. Meanwhile, the village elder put on his best smile, which turned into more of a grin, and turned around with his arms stretched out wide, uttering the words, "Folks, there has been a great misunderstanding." Before the villagers had realized what had happened, the boy and the sorcerer had long left the village of Skeybar. The boy now away from the comforts of his earlier life, the sorcerer simply happy he got the hell out of there. Chapter 2. The Journey Begins. A bird landed on the head of the sorcerer and laid 2 eggs. He took one and cracked it open in his mouth. The boy watched as his stomach turned. After turning it the right way up again, he asked the sorcerer for his name. "Old man, do you have a name?" The sorcerer looked at him while swallowing yet another bird egg. "My name is Adm.Skeybar, but you can call me Mvark." "I'm Lange Gravelsworth, of the Gravelsworth family." They continued walking down the mountain path in silence. One for the lack of things to say, the other saying far too many things, but only in his head and to no one in particular. The road was spiraling down the mountain, and they soon reached the forests below. The forests here were thin, and consisted mainly of Mikom pines and birch Mikom trees. They walked up to the part of the path that could only be described as the most obvious place for an ambush in all of Mikomwood. It was a cliff face, and several smaller rocks with a path going right in between them. More obvious, however, were the 4 bandits sitting on top of these rocks, and the bandit archers standing on top of the cliff. Lange, however, had the awareness of a blind, deaf, and possibly mute fox, therefore did not notice them. The sorcerer was too busy talking to himself that he couldn't be bothered to pay any attention. As you may recall, it was this very same mistake that he made earlier that led us into this mess. So upon walking below the cliff wall, the bandits jumped out of hiding and surrounded Lange and Mvark, who was still unaware to their presence. Lange jammed an elbow in the sorcerer's ribs. He said, "Oh," then looked around. Then he let out a sigh like, "Oh." The bandits were all short and wore rawhide clothing and leather straps around their foreheads, or nothing at all but a loincloth and some straps over their chests to hold the various pieces of cutlery they had in place. They had ugly noses and small squinting eyes. A fat fellow with a big feather in his hair and a particularly ugly nose took a step forward. He was no doubt the bandit chief. "Well, well, well, what have we got here?" he asked in a manner that showed he had to repeat that line for too long in his life and would welcome a change of career. Lange, having read about this in stories, knew what was going to happen. They were going to be roasted over a fire, then rescued by a hero, and then pulled through hell in a terrifying adventure, and then arriving back home with a shit ton of cash and some hutty lass that he picked up from a bar they happened to visit. As usual, he looked forward to none of these things, and immediately started looking for an alternative. "How about I just give you some coin and you leave?" the boy asked expectantly. "All of your coin?" the bandit chief asked. "No, I'd like to keep some for the bus fare back to Gravelsworth Valley." "No deal." Upon saying this, he drew his sword. In the distance, the expectant sigh of a tree could be heard. Lange realized he wasn't going to be able to bribe his way out of this situation and grabbed onto the sorcerer. "Do something!" he shouted. The sorcerer raised his arms, short and bony. "Ipsalum," Vark began. The bandits looked on, slightly entertained. This was a change from their usual stand-up comedy. He continued, "Meverium salamanderium hiccupslium." Then the bandit chief vanished in a flash. In his place was a small yet fat salamander. It let out a tiny hiccup. The bandits looked at where the chief had been standing. One of the bandits that could still move his jaw said in a dry voice, "How about we let you go this once?" "Good idea," Lange commanded with new-found courage. They quickly shuffled down the path, leaving the bandits looking at the fat salamander on the ground. It should be mentioned at this point that the bandit chief salamander was not entirely unhappy about this change in his life. He enjoyed looking at the world from this perspective. He hoped the hiccup would stop soon though, and he was still too fat to scratch below his belly. After about an hour's walk, the two away from homes arrived at a home. This was a home for hundreds and a market for thousands. It was smelly and the second largest concentration of scum anywhere in Mikomwood. It was the town of Roger. The town was known for being in the shape of a large top hat. The outer circle was a wall, inside of which was a circular market, and at the center of the market were the shops that ascended the sky in a way that had it been in any other universe, some fool would have called them skyscrapers. This was a ridiculous term, of course, and a technical impossibility, since everyone in Mikomwood knows that no one can scrape the sky but the gods when they got an itch on their celestial behind. Besides, it would be rude to jam a building up there. Well, you get the point. The northern gate was open, and out came a stream of easily gullible customers and traders. They started walking along the town wall towards the southern gate, which was the entrance of Roger. Lange had been in Roger before, but it was a long time ago, and he had been with his parents. It was the only time that the streets of Roger had not been crammed full of people, but had been open for the carriages of rich traders to pass through. The people of Roger did not mind this interference of daily life. Rich people meant profit, and profit meant, well, profit. Upon entering the town, Lange immediately started looking for the first shop that sold Hamish burgers. A street merchant approached them, but before he could utter a word, Lange interrupted him. "Where can I get a Hamish burger? They do have Hamish burgers, right? I could kill for a Hamish burger." The merchant looked at Lange. He pointed at an alleyway between some pie shops. Lange did not know much about the criminal underworld of Mikomwood. His philosophy was always to give people money, and in return they would give him free stuff. It was for this very reason that the two men dressed in black and brown that met him in the alleyway didn't seem suspicious at all, and even when they clubbed him and his older companion over the head, his last words were, "Why?" before passing out and being dragged further into the darkness. Lange woke up in a dark room. A room so dark he in fact didn't know if his eyes were open or not. He heard a moan to his right. Said an older voice in pain. "Are you all right?" he asked the sorcerer. The sorcerer had been confused for most of the day up to this point. The hit on his head, however, had knocked a sense of clarity into the old man's mind, and at a really bad time too, since this was a terrible moment to realize you've been kidnapped. He feared the fate that awaited him. "Yeah, I am," he replied. "Who were those men?" Lange began, but was quickly interrupted by the dark space suddenly shaking violently. He noticed light shining through a small crack in what he assumed was the wall. He fumbled towards it on his knees. "I see trees going past," Lange said, concerned. "By the gods! Trees have learned to walk and rebelled against other walking organisms." "We're in a carriage," Vark said dullishly. "The trees aren't moving, we are." This was in fact true. The boy and the sorcerer had been moved many Mikom miles away from their original location. Interestingly enough, they were heading back to the Grimsmerk Mountains. Lange and the sorcerer sat quietly in the back of the carriage. "Can't you?" Lange began. "No," Vark replied. "But I didn't even ask." "I know what you are going to ask, and the answer is no," Vark replied with a bitter voice. "But you did it to the bandit chief." "Ah, yes, but turning a little fat man into a salamander is easy. This carriage, however, is made out of wood. Older wood, too. I can't affect wood. Wood is immune to all forms of magic. In fact, it absorbs it." There was a brief silence.
So your weakness is wood? I mean, really?
Yes, no need to rub it in, the sorceress sighed.
I won't rub it in. I wouldn't want to give you splinters,
the boy said quietly. He could feel the old man staring at him angrily in the dark. About an hour passed by. Lange looked through the crack. The forests had been replaced with rocks and cliffs. He heard the driver shout something. The carriage stopped for a moment. Voices could be heard outside. Then the carriage started moving again. Short while later he saw it pull into a courtyard of an old-looking castle. There were many castles in Grimsmurk Mountains, many of which had belonged to the Grimswalders family, an old family of lords and ladies that practically owned the Grimsmurk Mountains. This was many hundreds of years ago, however, and now many of their castles stand empty or are being used by mad sorcerers. This one, however, was in use by the Trigian Order, a well-known brutish clan of slave traders that offered good quality product to anyone with loads of coin and no morals. The two captives heard the rustling of keys, a click, and then the back of the carriage opened. The light shining in was blinding. In the glowing ray of light, the outline of a large muscular man was visible as he pulled them out into the Mikomwood afternoon shade. Another man with a notebook and pen walked up to them and looked them up and down.
"All right, what do we have here, then?" he said with a disinterested voice.
Vark pulled on his chains around his feet. The man looked down at his notebook.
"1 rattler and 1 toddler," he noted.
"Hey, I'm 17, Lange corrected him. The man paid no attention and turned to the larger fellow. Vark raised his hands. The chains rattled.
"Saterium davarcius macmasala."
He didn't get to finish the spell before the large man behind them grabbed his mouth and ripped off a piece of the sorcerer's robe. He used it to quickly gag the old man. Then he reached into the back of the carriage and pulled out another set of chains. He bound the sorcerer's hand behind his back.
"It's the pit for these fellows," the man with the notebook said with slight intrigue, and then walked away muttering to himself. "The pit is about the only thing we can offer our customers nowadays. Business sure isn't what it used to be."
The brute of a man that was holding them pulled the two towards a small door being guarded by a soldier in red-striped leather armor that, had there been any actual chance of escape, no doubt would have been replaced by someone that actually knew the meaning of guard duty. He led them down through a narrow passageway, following more corridors until finally arriving at a row of 7 cells, most of them empty apart from the occasional skeleton and or dead cat. He opened the door to one of the cells and shoved them in.
"Thank you,"
Lange said as he closed the door. He was unsure as to why. Then he walked up to the sorcerer and removed his gag.
"Urgh," Vark spat on the ground. "One more word and this place would have been leveled to the ground."
"Ah, but you can get us out of here now, yes?" Lange said eagerly.
"No, I need my hands for that. The symbiosis between the hands and the spells is what powers magic."
Lange started to realize that magic was a lot more complicated than just muttering some words and stuff would happen. He found the interest he once had in this subject fading more and more. They stayed locked up in the cell for one boring and uneventful night, the quiet scene only being interrupted by the occasional rat peeking around a corner only to decide it wasn't worth a bother. Chapter 3. The Pit. The very next morning they were rudely awakened by the man with the notebook that had so graciously categorized them the day before. He was accompanied by 2 guards.
"Good morning, and how are we today?"
he said in a voice that suggested he really didn't care. Lange and Vark simply looked at him as he scribbled some words in his notebook.
"Very well."
He looked at the guard and pointed towards the 2 captives. The guard had a chain with him which he attached to the shackles already around their ankles. They were now attached to each other and marched out of the cell. The guard led them back through the many corridors out into a sunny Mikomwood morning. A second group of prisoners was already waiting in the courtyard. The group consisted mainly of farmers. Lange noted that one of the farmers, a muscular fellow, had an eye patch. The man Lange now started calling Mr. Notebook took place in front of the prisoners.
"Gentlemen, Your lives as people of Mikomwood are over. You are now warriors of the Trejan Order. May you die well in combat." Upon saying this, he once again scribbled something in his notebook and then walked up to a group of guards. Lange could not hear what they were saying. After the discussion was over, 2 of the guards started attaching the chains of the 2 groups of prisoners to the carriage. Shortly after, the carriage started moving and the guards took their place in line behind the prisoners. There was no chance of escape. They were once again being led down the rocky path of the Grimsmerk Mountains. Each step shaved against Lange's ankles, making him wish to whatever god was looking over Mikomwood that he would put him back where he'd come from, preferably with his memory wiped. This god, however, was too busy to notice the plea of the young man in shackles, for at this very moment an armada of 100 Cespitian sea raiders were nearing the shores of Mikomwood. He did not approve of this. If there was anyone to cause havoc and destruction in Mikomwood, then it would be him. The Cespitian captain, called Hebshakan, felt in a particularly optimistic mood today. He sat in the cabin of his ship, enjoying a fine wine and some grapes. He called over his first mate, with a little bell on his breakfast tray. "Are the lands of the Mikom heretics in sight?" he asked. "Yes, your excellency," the first mate replied. "Good. Prepare the boar," he began, but was quickly interrupted by the ship shaking violently, and a thunderous roar could be heard outside. The captain, though slightly on the fat side, still managed to quickly stagger his way out onto the main deck. He stared in terror as he saw the ship was no longer just off the shores of Mikomwood, but was in fact several thousand feet up in the air, falling rapidly. His men were throwing themselves overboard as is customary in a doomed scenario. He couldn't possibly imagine why, though, since there was no water to break their fall. He fell to his knees and prayed to Kaya, the Cespitian goddess of life. Lange noticed a town in the distance as they left the foothills of the Grimsmerk Mountains. "Oh no," Vark began. "What is it?" Lange asked. "That is not Roger," the sorcerer said, deeply concerned. "It isn't?" Lange replied, expecting a blank stare from the sorcerer. He got one and quickly faced forward. "You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy," the sorcerer said dramatically. "That just sounds like you read it in a book," Lange said. There was silence. After half an hour's march, they had made it to the gates of Not Roger. The streets were muddy, and though there were a fair amount of people around, it was nothing like the jolly show of traders, businessmen, and harmless pickpockets you'd find in Roger. The people here all wore dark clothes and always had one hand on the handle of their weapon of choice. The shops all had dark windows, and most of them had signs on their doors like, "Only one shady customer at a time," or "No trolls allowed." The carriage continued through the criss-crossing streets of Not Roger until it came to a halt at a large building. Its walls were rounded, and it seemed to go on for the remainder of the town length. This was Not Roger's colossal Eam, also known as the Pit. The driver got off and exchanged a few words with the guard at the entrance of the pit. Then he and the guard started uncoupling the chains from the carriage and took the prisoners around the side of the building, until coming to a smaller door with a sign, "Servant Entrance. If you're here to see people get gutted, we refer you to the main entrance and buy a bloody ticket." They entered. Inside the walls of the pit it was dark and damp. There were chains everywhere and more cells than one could count. A light revealed a little fat man sitting in a chair on a little podium at the back of the room. One of the guards walked up to him. Lange could see them exchanging words, then money and papers. The prisoner guard came back with a piece of paper and left through the door with the rest of his guards. Meanwhile, the little fat man called over some of his workers and walked up to the prisoners. "Hello, I'm the manager of the Colossal Eam and I will be your host tonight," he began. Lange gave him a confused look. "You will be pitted towards horrible adversaries and brutally slaughtered, but don't let that put you off. You will gain fame instantly." Then he turned towards Lange and Vark. He looked at the piece of paper he was holding. "Oh yes," he mumbled, and then continued. "You two, come with me. You are on for the lunch show in a short while. You must be so excited." Not real, Langy began, but quickly was interrupted by the manager's two assistants pulling them towards a large wooden pallet in the center of the room. They were put on the pallet, and the rustling of many chains could be heard. The floorboards opened, and the pallet was slowly lowered into the darkness. After a while it stopped, and the pallet tilted so Langy and the sorcerer started tumbling off it. They fell onto another wooden floor below with a big thud. The previous floor had now become the ceiling. The ceiling closed. It was pitch black.
"Bloody brilliant, this is," Vark said to no one in particular.
"What is?" said a female voice in the dark. Langy turned around, but was instantly unsure if he turned towards the voice or away from it. He whispered to Mivark.
"We are not alone in here." "No," Mivark confirmed.
"Why are you whispering? I can hear you just fine," the voice said. "Oh," said Langy. "Who or what are you?" he continued, after carefully making sure he left no eventuality unmentioned. "My name is Salona, champion fighter," Salona announced.
"Here to fight us?"
Vark asked curiously.
"No, we're the 2 o'clock lunch entertainment," Salona explained cheerfully.
"Bit later time for lunch," Langy jumped in, feeling this conversation was in need of his expertise on the subject. "Oh, the spectators will most likely already have had lunch by that time. We, however, are lunch for, well, creatures who don't care about what time of day it is," she added thoughtfully. They sat in silence. One could hear Mvark trying to violently loosen the shackles around his hands, unsuccessfully. At precisely 2 o'clock the ceiling opened. This, however, was a bigger hole. Light streamed in like a flood wave. Again the floor started shaking, and as their eyes adapted to the existence of light once more, a large platform rose up in the arena and the crowd went wild. This was entertainment. The arena was a large open space filled with pillars, broken pillars, pieces of rock and gravel that might at some point have been pillars, and various obstacles such as ropes, flaming pits, swinging morning stars, and axes. At least the entire town of Not Roger and neighboring villages were filling the spectator seats. "All right, I hope you know what to do," Salona said while keeping her eyes fixed on the gate at the far end of the arena. Langy looked at her. She was tall and had bright white armor. A sword was drawn, and she had taken a dramatic stance that suggested she had at least some idea of what was going to happen. Langy, however, or Mivark for that matter, did not.
"Excuse me, lady," Mivark began, "but could you be so kind as to get these shackles off me?"
Salona turned around. "Oh, I'm not so sure if that's allowed in this arena mode. You should have checked with your manager before signing up." She looked puzzled, and the question had clearly taken her by surprise. The sorcerer's left eye started blinking uncontrollably. He took a deep breath. Langy looked at her, embarrassed and confused. "Did you actually sign up for this voluntarily?" he gasped. "Oh, yes," she began, but then the sound of a large iron door opening was heard, and she turned towards it with lightning speed. "I don't know what your speciality is, but flank left towards the obstacle course if it's anything but direct assault." Upon saying this, she dashed right towards a pillar and took cover. Langy and Mivark looked at the gate, which was now fully open. Inside they could see only darkness. Then, in a purple haze, a group of 10 mad cow warriors came rushing out, swords and spears ready. Langy looked towards the pillar where Salona had been standing. She was gone. Mivark quickly nudged the boy with his shoulder and nodded his head towards the obstacle course Salona had pointed out. They ran as fast as their chains would allow. The mad cow warriors were some of the finest Harim had to offer. Naturally, this isn't saying much, since the mad cow tribes tend to go for maniacal chanting over anything that involves their own blood and gore. It was for this very reason that when Langy shouted, "I just wanted a Hamish burger," all 50 eyes of the mad cow warriors turned towards him in fury. It should be mentioned at this point that one of the prime ingredients of a Hamish burger is splashed mad cow priest. This did not go well with the mad cows. No pun intended. Mivark and Langy took cover behind one of the swinging axes.
"You just had to mention that, didn't you?" Mivark said, breathing heavily.
"How am I supposed to know what's in the food I eat?" Langy said hopelessly. Mavak was about to start another sentence as the Mad Cow warriors came dangerously close in their attack. In sheer desperation, Mavak nudged the axe with his head while grabbing onto Langy with the hand still shackled behind his back. The axe flipped up, dislodged itself from its axis, and flew through the air, hitting a Mad Cow warrior flat in the face. There was an unsightly amount of blood. Mavak and Langy looked at each other. "What can I say? They splash well," said Langy. It was at this point Salona showed up and sliced the neck of another 2 Mad Cow warriors before the rest could even turn around. The other Mad Cows quickly prioritized and set after her as she dodged one obstacle in the course after another. The crowds were cheering. Langy looked up at the crowd while smiling faintly. He took a step back, right into a snake pit that he failed to spot right behind him. Mavak, who was still attached to Langy by the legs, felt them pulled away from under him as both tumbled down the slope of the pit. Luckily, there were no actual snakes in the pit. Many of the original animals tasked with populating the arena had long since died. The architect thought in short-term plans only, and never notified the pit keepers about the maintenance of exotic animals. Langy pulled himself up, and tried giving the sorcerer a hand. Mavak rolled around onto his belly, and then grabbed the boy's hand. He pulled him up. At the edge of the pit stood Salona, looking down at them. "You 2 are the worst champions I've ever seen," she noted. Langy sighed. Salona helped the boy and the sorcerer out of the pit and brushed some snakeskin off the old man's robe. The arena was now silent. An occasional "boo" could be heard from an impatient spectator. The obstacle course was now covered in fresh blood and splashed Mad Cow warriors. "You did all this?" Langy said, shocked. "Oh, this was just a foreplay, if you pardon the expression," Salona explained. Langy ignored the various signals going off in his body and thought about the horrors that may come through that gate if these were just starters. He looked at Mavak, who clearly had exactly the same thoughts he did. "Say, how about you cut me loose from these chains?" Mavak asked her in as polite a voice as he could manage. "I told you, I'm not sure if it's allowed," she said, poking an unsplashed Mad Cow warrior in the gut. "Look here, lady," he began, but then once more the giant iron doors started moving, and having completely forgotten what he was going to say, Mavak, as well as Langy and Selena, started staring expectantly at what the darkness would reveal next. At first there was a loud thud, then 3 roars, and all of a sudden 3 large mountain trolls with spiked clubs and thick steel plate armor came thundering out of the gate. One in his charge nudged a pillar. It simply shattered. The crowds went wild. "All right, not doing this," Salona said as the rest of the pillar hit the ground. "Get these shackles off me and you won't have to. My magic will destroy these beings as if they were dust," Mavak shouted. Salona turned around. "Whatever you've got up your sleeve, I sure hope it's not a bunny rabbit." Salona took her sword and put it against the lock of the shackles. She pulled. It flew off with a loud clang. Mavak whispered some words and the rest of their shackles fell off. Langy rubbed his ankles that were red and bruised. The trolls were nearing the trio, and their approach was now vibrating the ground. The manager was standing on the VIP platform of the arena, observing what he thought was one of his best shows so far, a masterpiece of entertainment conjured by careful planning. The trolls were an all-time classic, bound to give the audiences, young and old, the show of masterful carnage and destruction they'd always dreamed to see. A cloud moved in front of the sun. He hoped it would go away. Varg raised his hands. The trolls stopped. Trolls have a very good sense of instinct, and right now it was going off like an alarm in a fire station. The sorcerer completed his spell and fired a burst of pure plasma at the first of the trolls. It melted parts of his armor and singed his skin, but left him otherwise unharmed. The trolls were not looking at the sorcerer. It occurred to Mavak that something else was afoot. He followed the troll's gaze. It was looking up. High above, among the clouds, an armada of 100 Cespitian ships came tumbling towards the arena with hissing speed. Captain Habshakan noted in his journal that if they were going to die, they would try to take out a Mikomwood city with them, and so he had managed to coordinate with a small portion of his captains through excessive shouting and occasionally throwing over a dispensable crew member. they had managed to strap 2 ships together in mid-air in what was one of the most masterful naval maneuvers, or aerial, if you will, ever attempted in or above Mikomwood. By repurposing the sails as wings, they had gained enough control to successfully pick a reachable target. For luck had it that upon regaining control of their ships, they had spotted a small dot on the ground that was no doubt a large and important Mikomwood city. 12 other ships had managed to do the same, while the rest of the ships crashed to a painful and splashy death in the mountains below. It would puzzle future historians for centuries to come how there could be so many shipwrecks high up in the Grimsmirk Mountains. Lange had seen it too. Salona let out a gasp as one of the less fortunate crewmen hit the ground only a few micrometers away from where she was standing. In the distance, strange and foreign curses could be heard as the captains of the ships prepared for impact. Mivark grabbed Lange and Salona by their clothes, and they started running away from the big ship-shaped shadow that grew bigger and bigger on the ground only a few micrometers to their left. As they ran for cover, the first of the ships crashed into the arena and exploded in a hailstorm of timber and fire. A second ship was incoming and crashed onto the big wooden platform that had raced them up to ground level earlier. It partially splintered under the massive shockwave of the explosion. "Come with me!" shouted Salona. Mivark and Lange didn't see a better alternative, so they followed the white lightning bolt that was Salona towards the burning wreck of the platform. They ran alongside it till they found a piece that wasn't burning. Salona jumped onto the wooden beams. She slid down until finally rolling off the beam onto the sand below. Lange and Mivark soon followed. They were now underneath the arena again, and the distant muffled sounds of crashes could be heard in Not Roger. Another huge bang on the arena floor. Then silence. There was dust everywhere. They looked up and saw the burning wooden beams of ships, supports, and more unidentifiable parts. "Here," said Lange, who had found a way back up. There were some beams lying criss-cross over the broken parts of the arena platform that did indeed prove an unsteady way back up to the light of day. The sight that met them there as they emerged from the wreckage was just that. More wreckage. The town of Not Roger was burning. Well, not burning as such. It was too damp in Not Roger for the city to catch on fire completely, but it was smoking. The spectators that had survived the bombing had long since run away. Part of the arena wall had been completely destroyed, and so had 2 houses behind the wall. It was here that the trio exited the remainders of the pit, and walked the streets of Not Roger, dense with smoke. Upon rounding a corner, they heard voices screaming behind them. "There they are! That's him! He caused this!" Several city guards, the arena manager, as well as the Trigian slavers that had brought him here were grouped together at the end of the street. Though more cautiously now, they slowly started moving towards the sorcerer, feeling each step and seeing how he would react. "Can't you do something?" Lange gave the sorcerer a worried look. "No, I started noticing it in the arena already. This whole town is made of wood. It's draining my powers," Mivark stated. Lange rolled his eyes and grabbed the sorcerer by the arm. They started running. Their followers started running. They rounded a corner and sprinted into an alleyway. They watched as their pursuers ran past. Having lost their pursuers briefly, they figured it would be best to head for the city gates. They found the city gates wide open and unguarded. As a stroke of added luck, they also found 4 horses tied to a log in front of the guardhouse. The horses were nervous, but since they wanted to leave this burning dump just as much as the trio, they willingly let themselves be mounted and galloped out of the city gates, just as the followers once again showed up for dramatic effect. "Where do we go?" Lange shouted. "Anywhere that's not here suits me," said Mivark. The road took them north to the River Moom. They followed the river until they found a bridge crossing the water. It was not until they reached the other side that they finally dismounted and let themselves, as well as the horses, rest for a while. The horses, on the other hand, had had it with these humans and took the first opportunity they could to run away. This time happened to be when Lange tried to tie them to a tree but forgot how to tie a proper knot. They sprinted off in the distance and were never seen again. "What did you do?" asked Salona. "I have no idea," said Lange. Mivark simply rested his arm on the tree and sighed. The tree liked this. They stayed in the spot for the rest of the night. The very next morning they set out on foot again. They headed southwest through the thick forest following the River Moom. Chapter 4. Finale. "What did you say this forest was called again?" asked Salona.
"The Forests of Moom, if I'm not mistaken," said Mivark.
They'd been walking since dawn, and now the sun could be seen through the trees high up in the sky. "Oh, what I would give for a Hamish burger," Langy said longingly.
"Stop thinking about food," said Mivark, as he felt his empty stomach aching for something to eat.
The forests were getting thinner. The River Moom could still be seen through the trees. It was wider now. In the distance, on the other side of the river, there was a plume of smoke. It would seem the fires in Knot Roger were more serious than they first appeared. This was not what concerned the three tired wanderers right now. Howling and barking could be heard in a northern direction. Mivark turned around.
"Whiffles,"
he said with a deep yet quiet voice. The Whiffles of Mikomwood were small yet highly aggressive dog-wolf hybrids bred by the huntsmen in the northern Moom Valley. Normally they were used for hunting purposes, but this felt like they were looking for something more specific.
"We need to get out of this damned forest,"
he said as he started moving with ever-increasing speed.
"I don't like the sound of this," said Salona.
As they hurried out on the plains before them, leaving the last trees behind, the sound of the Whiffles could be heard only just beyond the darker trees. They ran up a small hill with some stones in a suspiciously round circle.
"We make our stand here," said Mivark with new-found yet mad courage. "We can't outrun them anyway."
"Are you sure?" said Langy. "I mean, we could try."
"He is right," Salona confirmed. "This is just as good a spot as any." Mivark inspected the stone circle.
"Yes, this will do. This will do nicely."
He sat down in the middle of the circle and closed his eyes. Dark clouds started forming in the sky above. Thunder could be heard. Salona looked on. Her facial expression suggested admiration.
"Now if only I could do that," she said.
The Whiffles could now be seen running among the trees, a whole flock of them followed by a group of men dressed in leather armor with red stripes. The Trigian Order.
"Here they come!" shouted Salona.
Langy took cover behind a rock. Mivark was still sitting in the stone circle with his hands raised, humming to himself. The Trigian search party had clearly spotted them as well, because now they started shouting orders and drawing swords. Then, with a huge crack and the big thud of 3 trees falling to the ground, one of the arena trolls came roaring out of the woods. Riding it was a slightly wild-looking arena manager, shouting things like,
"For the yearly revenue, may your lawyers not beat mine!"
The group of attackers was now nearing the hilltop. A lightning bolt struck the ground in front of them. Mivark's eyes were oozing black smoke. Another lightning bolt struck the ground. This halted their attack. The ground where the bolt had struck was smoking. A small flame could be seen. The smoke grew bigger and darker. It started shaping itself. Letters could be seen. The attacker looked on, startled and confused. Even the manager had briefly stopped his mad cursing. A sentence could be seen. It read, "I hate wood." Then the smoke vanished in a poof. The ground started to shake and it cracked open. A rocky hand could be seen. Fingertips oozing with black smoke, the Whiffles started howling while slowly backing off. The rock manifestation now heaved itself with great force out of the hole in the ground and rose above it in a mighty fashion. Instead of a head, it had nothing but black smoke circulating floating bedrock. The troll, figuring he was the only one who could actually have a chance against this monstrosity, raised his war axe and prepared for attack. The manifestation turned its bedrock toward him, dark smoke substituting as eye holes. It clenched its rocky fist, and with one hard blow punched the troll into the ground. There was dust and dark smoke surrounding the rocky fist as it slowly retracted its arm. Pieces of dirt and rock fell off. Salona and Langy looked on in amazement as the manifestation took one step back and raised itself to its full height. The Trigian hunters slowly backed away, stopped and looked at each other for dramatic effect, then ran as fast as they could. The Whiffles followed their masters with desperate dedication. The manifestation slowly started crumbling, but as a final deterrent it sent several bolts of black smoke after them. Then it started crumbling. The black smoke started fading until finally vanishing completely. The rocky body parts, no longer suspended by magic, now fell to the ground and created yet another mysterious rock formation that would puzzle future geologists. Mivark let out a sigh. Lange and Solana turned around. The old man was still sitting down. He was resting his arms on his legs. Grey smoke was coming out of his ears. Solana pulled the man to his feet. She nodded at him with wide eyes. "Most impressive," she said. "There's a ferry over there," Lange shouted. He had climbed up on one of the rocks to scout the area. "I guess we better get going then," said Solana. Lange climbed down and she grabbed a sword which had been resting against a nearby stone. The ferryman had had the strangest day. First he had observed what seemed to be suicidal dragons bombard the city of Not Roger, and observed the city smoking even as he woke up for his early morning shift. Then, on the other side of the river, a small localized thunderstorm appeared, and a giant rock monster was briefly visible before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. So when the old man, the impatient young boy, and the unusually cheerful lady asked to ride his ferry to the other side but had no coin to pay him with, he found himself simply nodding and doing as they asked. As he observed them walk south along the river, he couldn't help but wonder if they had anything to do with all this. Lange turned towards the sorcerer. "So, where to now? I'm as lost as a chicken in a fox factory." Mivark appeared to think about what the boy had said, but quickly dismissed the thought. "To the city of the elves," he said mysteriously. "The elves?" "Well, elves live there," he said, sounding uncertain. "The city of Mikomwood is widely known for having the largest elf population in all of Mikomwood." "Put, elves," said Solana. "They're overrated, stuck-up, boring, caught in traditions not even they know if they're theirs or if they just stole it from someone else." "But aren't elves the most beautiful creatures in all of Mikomwood?" Lange asked, surprised. "Look at this." Solana pulled back her hair and revealed a pointed ear. "I look like an imp." She was radiating insecurity. There was an awkward silence. "So you are an elf?" Lange asked expectantly. "Half-elf," she said sheepishly. "My father was a trader from Eastwood, and my mother ran a beauty salon in Seasick. Both died during a pirate raid in the city 10 years ago." Mivark and Lange looked saddened by this story. "So, do they have Hamish burgers in Vinaymiar?" "Lange, there are more important things in life than a good lunch," the sorcerer said. Lange gasped at this terrible lie he had just heard. "Besides, elves are vegetarians," said Solana. The city of Vinaymiar could be seen in the distance. After a short walk, they arrived at the city gates. They were greeted by 2 elven guards. Solana hissed at them. Vinaymiar was, unlike Roger and Not Roger, a town for honest folk. A town where you could sell a piece of jewelry and expect it to be worn instead of popping up on the market 2 stalls down for twice the price. Not a single fast food establishment could be seen. Lange was disappointed. "What now? We have no money," asked Solana. "I think I'm going home," said Mivark. "You're welcome to join me as far as Riffles." The sorcerer looked determined. "Lange Gravelsworth!" shouted a voice behind them. Lange, Mivark, and Solana all turned around at the same time. There was a little fat elf standing in the street behind them, accompanied by the 2 guards that had greeted them at the city gates. "Do I know you?" asked Lange, while trying to remember if he'd seen the man before. "My dear boy, we had feared the worst," the man began. "My name is Vuyun. I am the mayor of Vinaymiar and a good friend of your parents. When I heard the news of your disappearance, I immediately sent out a search party. To think that you would simply walk into my city," the man chuckled. Lange gave him a faint smile. Solana and Mivark stood by in awkward silence. Come, you must be hungry," the mayor said. Lange looked at Mivark, who gave no argument, and then set after the mayor and his guards. At the mayor's palace they were treated to the most delicious of elven delicacies. Even Lange thoroughly enjoyed the feast. At the head of the table sat the mayor discussing various city businesses with his advisors. The advisors left him, though, and he turned to Langy.
You're welcome to stay here for as long as you like.
Actually, Langy began, after swallowing another honey cookie, I would like to go home. I will have my fastest carriage ready for you by the time you finish your meal, the mayor said with a smile. Upon finishing their meals, Langy, Mivok, and Selena were put in the mayor's private carriage and set out for Gravelsworth Valley. They went along the Muir Forest, by the town of Riffles, over the river Hosian, through the Gravelsworth Valley itself, before arriving at the Gravelsworth estate. The carriage stopped in front of the estate entrance, and they were greeted by a familiar face.
Welcome back, sir, said Sleeves the butler. Should I prepare the spare bedrooms for your guests? Actually, said Mivok, I think we're going home too.
Yes, said Solana. Mivok has agreed to take me on as his apprentice. Langy looked surprised. When did you decide this? He asked.
In the carriage when you were asleep, Mivok noted.
Oh, said the boy. Well, I guess I wish you the best of luck, then. You too, said Solana. She bent over to look out of the carriage window. Nice house, by the way.
Thank you, Sleeves mumbled without realizing it. It has been quite the adventure, Mivok began. I don't think I ever thanked you for saving my life in that village, so thank you. He shook the boy's hand.
Where are you going to go? Langy asked, puzzled. Your old castle was taken over by angry villagers, remember?
Oh, I know another castle in the mountains that will do just fine. After I clear out the current occupants, of course, and free their prisoners. I need my dungeons clean and empty, Mivok said with a faint smile.
Langy smiled too. He waved at the carriage as it left the estate grounds. Then he walked along the wall of the house. Sleeves followed. He found his little brother playing with some marble toys. Langy sat down in one of the lawn chairs. He looked out over Gravelsworth Valley. In the distance, a carriage could be seen, riding on the road. He turned to his butler. What's for dinner? He asked.
I was thinking Hamish burgers, sir, Sleeves replied.
That sounds excellent. The end. But wait! What happened to the Salamander Bandit Chief and the town of Not Roger? Well, the Bandit Chief continued to lead the group of bandits in the Grimsmirk Mountains. His hiccups had stopped, and he'd once again found a new and interesting challenge in the life of banditry. The town of Not Roger had been badly damaged, yes. However, the Trigian Order, just before being mysteriously wiped from the map of Mikomwood, had found a whole group of Cespitian sea raiders in the Grimsmirk Mountains, which they sold for a mediocre price to the management of Not Roger. The town and its arena had been rebuilt within weeks. The actual end.